Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you resoundingly to the 26th Forum in the Roundtable series at New South Wales Parliament House. That's where we are, if you have any doubts in the matter. This is the 26th. The topic this evening, as advertised, is Australia's future in Asia. And we have a very distinguished panel of speakers tonight. We've always had a distinguished panel, but tonight more so. And the panel are Professor Kerry Brown, Executive Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, Professor James Avantakis, Lecturer Humanities at the University of Western Sydney, Professor John Ingleson, former Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of New South Wales and the University of Western Sydney, and Adjunct Professor Richard Bronowski, who is the former Australian Ambassador to Vietnam and South Korea, and many other things on top of that. Now, the forums are sponsored by Western Heritage Australia, and that's a long-established discussion and study group aiming to raise consciousness on all issues that concern the thinking people, and to welcome all opinions without fear or favour. Now, this organisation of ours, which is small and discreet, has no connection whatsoever with any political party or organisation, any church or cult or business. We're totally non-profit, and all donations are spent on internet publicity and running forums like the one you're at now. So we just do it, basically, for the love of it, and it's a joyful thing to do. It goes without saying that the guest speakers and their opinions are not linked in any way with Western Heritage. Their opinions are entirely their own and not connected with us. And the questions are going to be invited from the audience when all four speakers have concluded, but not until they're finished. Now, our next forum, number 27, will be held in the Macquarie Room on Wednesday, March the 26th, at 6 p.m. And the topic, I believe, is Australia committing suicide. So you won't want to miss that one, will you? Our first speaker is Professor Kerry Brown, and he is Executive Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, Professor of Chinese Politics. He was previously head of the Asia Programme at Chatham House. He leads the Europe-China Research and Advice Network, founded by the European Union, educated at Cambridge, London, and Leeds universities. He worked in Japan and the Inner Mongolian region of China before joining the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. He worked in the China section and then served as First Secretary Beijing from 2000 to 2003 and head of the Indonesia East Timor section from 2003 to 5. He's Research Associate of the Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy and a Senior Fellow of the China Policy Institute at Nottingham University and the LSE Ideas Centre, as well as being an affiliate scholar with the Mongolia and Inner Asian Studies Unit at Cambridge University, and he's also an Associate Fellow of Chatham House, London. I won't read you any more. You'll be able to divine from this thumbnail sketch that he's a very distinguished speaker indeed, and we're very, very privileged to have Professor Kerry Brown. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much for inviting me here, and it's great to be here. So I think for 20 minutes, I know that other panellists will be talking probably more broadly about Asia. So I think I'll just talk about the thing that I have some ability to talk about, which is really China, because that sits at the centre of this issue and its challenges to the politics of Australia and the vision of Australia in the region, to where I've just moved in the last year and a half from the UK. Obviously it's very, very important, something that's really become clear to me in the last 18 months. I mean, China presents all sorts of issues for policymakers. As someone who used to work with politicians in the UK and still works with politicians in the European Union and here, I suppose I really just want to talk about the nature of those challenges but also the opportunities of those challenges. One of the very accessible treatments of China and its vision of itself is a book called The Fat Years by a Chinese author called Chen Honggang, who is actually, I think, originally from Hong Kong and Canada and now lives in Beijing. This was a very controversial book published in 2010, I think, and it's a satire really on what is China. The final chapter is really an official, it's all fictional, but it's an official from the Politburo of the Standing Committee of the Communist Party of China is kidnapped by a bunch of artists, and he is forced to confess what is the Communist Party of China's vision. He says, well, it's very simple really. We want China to be like the big uncle of Asia. We want to sit in Beijing with our patriarchal kind of warmth and love, in which everyone looks at us and regards us as a source of nurture and comfort and stability. Probably less serious is that this Politburo member says, we have a very easy way of making our people happy. We have drugged the water. What's the problem? In Hong Kong, they put fluoride in the water. So why don't we make people happy by spacing them out? I did actually last week in Beijing drink the water. I have been happy ever since. Maybe it's something that we should study in New South Wales. The vision thing, though, is important. And when we hear Xi Jinping, the current party secretary and the key figure of the new leadership that came in since last November, we hear, I think, a very patriarchal view of China's role. China is, it seems, very aware of the fact that its economy has incredibly grown, it's powerful, it's a source of growth, its domestic market is increasingly important, and therefore it is very aware of its power and prowess. Who wouldn't be? Since 2000 alone, and its entry, I think in 2001, when I was officially serving in Beijing, it has increased its economy 4 times. What country would not get a little heady thinking, wow, we have achieved a great deal? And therefore, one of the problems really is that China lives with this awareness of the enormous importance of its economy as a source of growth, as a source not only for itself, but for the rest of the world of development and dynamism in the coming decade, as it doubles its GDP, which is the stated government aim, by 2020 and becomes a middle-income country with a per capita GDP of about 12 to 13 thousand US dollars. What country would not really be aware of its emerging importance? As Mo Bokao, a very fine scholar now based in Adelaide, said, this is a country, after all, where the average life expectancy in 1949, when the revolution happened, was 32 years old. And now it's 76. It has achieved, obviously, a huge amount. It has lifted, according to the World Bank, 400 million people out of poverty in the last 3 decades since reform opening up started in 1978. And so it, as a government, as a system, has many, many things to be proud of. And yet it also feels, as the chief propagandist in the Politburo, a man called Liu Yunshan, who lived in the area that I lived in Inner Mongolia in the 1980s, I lived there in the mid-1990s, Liu Yunshan has complained as the head of propaganda on this Politburo that China is misunderstood. A bunch of bloggers led by a guy called Wang Xiaodong in 2009 wrote a book which is called in Chinese 中国不高兴, China is unhappy, that I like to translate it as China is pissed. It is unhappy, according to Wang Xiaodong and the people around him, because dumb foreigners don't get it. The world is changing. The imperium of the United States is over. Bit by bit, it's coming to an end. The energy of the United States is basically declining. But they also feel that their elites in Beijing don't get it. Wang Xiaodong and his fellow authors complain that their political elites have completely made China into a sweatshop for the rest of the world. They have created in the Pearl River Delta an enormous series of factories and different places which have created Chinese who live with great insecurity, are part of the 232 million who are sort of migrant labourers, people with no real security, who live without social welfare, who live really just because they are creating wealth in which tomorrow is better than today. And these migrant labourers feel they too have not been recognised because they have been the great foot soldiers of China's wealth creation since 1978. They have been the ones that have lived with this extraordinary kind of sacrifice while they've moved to cities and worked in factories, in the service sector, in restaurants, and according to a report issued by a Singapore think tank in 2003, 9 million sex workers. So this is a group that have really, really sacrificed a lot for what China is becoming and is now. Xi Jinping, the current leader, talks in a kind of very abstract way of what we call the China Dream. And there has been great sort of interest since he started using this term about a year ago of what it means, and obviously what it means here. The China Dream is something that he has made clear really applies to the average Chinese and their vision of what their lives will be in the coming decade. And for them, I think, and for the way that he speaks about it, the China Dream is the lives that you have here in Sydney now. It is the lives of great wealth, the middle class society, relative equality, of justice and equity. Most Chinese would give up a lot to have the kind of lives that we have here. For them, therefore, it's not about global domination. It's not about marching across the rest of the world with their companies like Huawei, which has, of course, been very controversial here and elsewhere, and taking over the planet. For the vast majority of Chinese that are on blogs like Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, and Weixin, for them, the China Dream is having the kind of lives that developed countries have. And they feel, and I propose that this is absolutely rational, that we have no moral or other reason to deny them this. There is a problem, however, a huge problem, and that's our problem. Because many of the things that the Chinese economy is predicated on now are unsustainable. Its toll on the environment in China, its toll on water usage in China, its toll on the natural environment in China has been devastating. In less than 30 years, China has tried to achieve what the West, developed countries, achieved over maybe 100 years. They have paid a huge environmental price for where they are now. Anyone who visits China, I know Richard was there a couple of weeks ago, you can see the extraordinary smog and the kind of problems with the air quality, and Chinese people are particularly unhappy about this. This impacts on their health. And therefore, I suppose we have to look at these aspirations, we have to look at strategies for engagement, and so part of my job, as was referred to for the European Union and here, is really trying to think of how do we engage with this in a smart way. Australia is in an interesting position. So in the last 18 months, I've been able to observe, in this very building, there was a big discussion on the Australia in the Asian century. I'm sure other speakers will address that in a more knowledgeable way than I can. There's been a defence white paper, the second, I think, in 4 years, and a defence white paper which is completely different to the one produced, I think, in 2009, in its tone and in its kind of focus. There's also been, by DFAT, a policy paper on China, and these three documents have made me really wonder whether Australia has a policy on China. I guess you can therefore ask, do you need a policy? Do we need a policy on China? I mean, do we need a policy? But I suppose there are particular questions and challenges as we go into the next decade where opportunities will come, and we have to have coherent responses across the state and federal government. And at the moment, I think a lot of incoherency reigns. Do not be misled by that old issue of whether you choose America or China. Do you go with America for security or China for trade? I would say that trade and security are the same thing. I mean, if you don't have a good economy, you have insecurity. And if you want security without the money to pay for it, that's kind of not possible. Do not feel that America's loyalty will be so deep that they will freely and with benevolent love give Australia, their little brother here, everything they want. So I think we have to think very hard about the link between security and trade, and how you think of smart ways of showing that you can be coherent with those choices. We also have to think beyond 10 or 20 years to a world where probably America is so overwhelmed by its own issues, there have to be other choices for other partners. And we have to look at what America has done really in its ability to choose extraordinary alliances This is something we have to respect. Bruce Jacobs, in an amazing book on America, said there has never been an imperium like America. 650 military installations in 125 countries. What an extraordinary set of alliances. And that's something I think we really have to respect. When we look at China, I guess for policymakers here, we look beyond the abstract language of what the China dream is and all the emotions and feelings about that. We do look upon beyond all the emotions about, oh, China's coming here to buy up all our companies, to buy all our property, and all these sort of very grand statements. The statistics say a more complicated story. And for smart policy, we have to think of smart engagement. The overwhelming sense I get looking at elite leaders in Beijing now is that they view things almost always in domestic terms. Well, do they give much thought to the world outside? They give a lot of thought to America. They have to give a lot of thought to America. The heart of American is always, and as I say after many years as someone from Britain, profound disappointment that you're not like them. We always try to live up to what America wants from us, but we will never succeed. And I suppose for China they have a similar mindset. They have to live up to this extraordinary pressure from America. They have very little strategic space. And they also, I think, now are in the market for new alliances. But I suppose we also have to think of China being not just one, but many places. We have to deal with Asia, but when we look at China, we deal with a continental-sized economy in which Shanghai people probably have lifestyles not dissimilar to the people here, a strong finance sector which is growing, an extraordinary vibrancy, whereas Gansu in the northwest has a per capita GDP of about 4,000 US dollars. Tibet, even lower. We have to think of a China which is very local. We don't have to think of Beijing or Shanghai. We have to think of multiple Chinas and how we engage with different parts of that. But we also have to think of a China which is complicated because I would argue that the average Chinese is a profoundly global citizen, probably more than people here. That sounds strange. We think, oh, China behind the Great Wall, it's only really emerged in the last 30 years. But China has bought into the global and the globalizing agenda, I think, in very profound ways. Look at the extraordinary amounts of people who use the internet, who are on Weibo, as referred to. I mean, something like 500 million people are active on Weibo, something like 900 million people are users of mobile phones and surf the internet. China has, I think, profoundly, and the Chinese citizen has profoundly accepted their role in the world. I just sort of give you one thought which I had from a student today that I'd never really thought of. She, having moved here from China and lived here a few years, said that she felt incredibly disappointed with what she had learnt while she was living in Australia, in Sydney. Not in a bad way, but she just said that she felt that she had been misled by the media in China, which had told her that abroad was always paradise. So this is a very strange idea. You think, oh my God, the Chinese always bang on about, the media always say how terrible things are abroad. But she said, and I think she's probably right, and if you go to China and